The woods were silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the cold, biting wind. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance to escape the chaos of the city, to reconnect with nature, and maybe even with each other. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the forest floor, it became clear that this trip would be anything but peaceful. The group of 5 friends had been hiking for hours, their laughter and chatter slowly fading as the reality of their situation set in. They were lost. The trail markers they'd been following had disappeared, swallowed by the dense undergrowth. The map they'd brought was useless, the landmarks unrecognizable. And now, as the last rays of sunlight vanished, the woods seemed to close in around them, dark and suffocating. "We should have turned back hours ago," muttered Sarah, her voice trembling. She hugged her arms tightly around herself, her breath visible in the freezing air. "We'll be fine," said Mark, the self-appointed leader of the group. His voice was steady, but his eyes darted nervously through the trees. "We just need to find shelter for the night. We'll figure it out in the morning." But the others weren't so sure. There was something about these woods, something wrong. The trees seemed too tall, their branches twisting unnaturally against the darkening sky. The air smelled faintly of decay, like something had died nearby. And then there were the sounds, faint, almost imperceptible, but there. A low, guttural growl, the snap of a twig, the whisper of something moving just out of sight. It was Emily who first noticed the cabin. "Look," she said, pointing through the trees. "Over there." The others turned, their eyes widening as they saw it. A small, dilapidated cabin, its wooden walls warped and splintered, its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, but there was a faint glow coming from one of the windows, a flickering, orange light, like a fire burning inside. "Someone's there," said Jake, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or something," added Sarah, her eyes wide with fear. Mark hesitated, then nodded. "We don't have a choice. It's either that or freeze out here." The group moved cautiously toward the cabin, their footsteps crunching in the snow. As they got closer, the details became clearer. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, swaying slightly in the wind. The windows were cracked and filthy, but through the grime, they could see the faint outline of a figure moving inside. Mark knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the silent woods. For a moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. The man who stood in the doorway was tall and gaunt, his face pale and hollow-cheeked. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they seemed to bore into each of them in turn. He wore a tattered flannel shirt and jeans, both stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Mark forced a smile. "We're lost. We were hoping we could stay here for the night." The man stared at them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. The inside of the cabin was even worse than the outside. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the floorboards warped and creaking underfoot. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic. In the center of the room was a small, crackling fire, its light casting flickering shadows on the walls. "Sit," the man said, gesturing to a rickety table in the corner. The group hesitated, then obeyed, their eyes darting nervously around the room. The man disappeared into a back room, returning a moment later with a tray of mismatched cups and a steaming pot of tea. "Drink," he said, pouring the tea into the cups. "It'll warm you up." The tea was bitter and smelled faintly of herbs, but the group drank it gratefully, their hands trembling as they held the cups. The man watched them in silence, his dark eyes never leaving their faces. "What's your name?" Emily asked, trying to break the tension. The man didn't answer at first. Then, slowly, he smiled, a cold, humorless smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You can call me Eli," he said. The name sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. There was something about the way he said it, something that made her skin crawl. As the night wore on, the group began to relax slightly. The warmth of the fire and the tea eased their nerves, and they started to talk amongst themselves, laughing nervously at their predicament. But Eli remained silent, his eyes fixed on the fire, his expression unreadable. It wasn't until much later, when the fire had burned down to embers and the group was beginning to doze off, that they noticed the strange carvings on the walls. "What are those?" Jake asked, squinting at the symbols etched into the wood. Eli didn't answer. Instead, he stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. "It's time," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Time for what?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. Eli smiled again, that same cold, humorless smile. "Time to play." The room seemed to grow colder as Eli's words hung in the air. The fire's dying embers cast flickering shadows that danced across the walls, making the strange carvings seem alive. The group froze, their laughter replaced by a suffocating silence. "Play," Sarah repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Her eyes darted to the door, but it was too far away. Eli stood between them and the exit, his tall frame blocking their only way out. Eli didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, rusted knife. The blade glinted in the dim light, and the group instinctively recoiled. "What do you want from us?" Mark demanded, his voice shaking despite his attempt to sound brave. Eli tilted his head, his dark eyes narrowing. "You came here," he said slowly, as if explaining something obvious. "You knocked on my door. You drank my tea. Now, you'll play my game." "This isn't funny," Emily said, her voice rising in panic. "Let us go." Eli's smile widened, revealing yellowed teeth. "Oh, it's not supposed to be funny." Before anyone could react, Eli lunged forward, grabbing Jake by the arm and yanking him to his feet. Jake let out a strangled cry, struggling against Eli's grip, but the man was unnaturally strong. "Let him go," Mark shouted, standing up, but Eli swung the knife in his direction, forcing him to back down. "Sit," Eli growled, his voice low and guttural, "or I'll make this much worse." The group obeyed, their hearts pounding as they watched Eli drag Jake to the center of the room. He forced Jake to his knees, then began circling him like a predator sizing up its prey. "The rules are simple," Eli said, his voice calm and measured. "I ask a question. You answer. If you lie, well, let's just say I'll know." Jake's breath came in short, panicked gasps. "What kind of questions?" Eli stopped in front of him, his expression unreadable. "Tell me, Jake," he said, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Have you ever hurt someone?" Jake hesitated, his eyes darting to his friends. "And no," he stammered. Eli's smile vanished. He moved so quickly that no one had time to react. The knife flashed, and Jake let out a blood-curdling scream as the blade sliced across his arm. "Liar," Eli hissed, his voice filled with venom. The group screamed, scrambling to their feet, but Eli turned to them, his knife raised. "Sit down." They obeyed, their faces pale with terror. Jake clutched his bleeding arm, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Let's try again," Eli said, his tone eerily calm. "Have you ever hurt someone, Jake?" Jake nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face. "Why, yes. I got into a fight in high school. I broke someone's nose." Eli tilted his head, considering this. Then, to everyone's shock, he smiled. "Good. Honesty is important." He turned to the others, his gaze sweeping over them like a predator, choosing its next victim. "Who's next?" No one spoke. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and Jake's labored breathing. Eli's eyes landed on Sarah. "You," he said, pointing the knife at her. "Stand up." Sarah shook her head, her entire body trembling. "Please, I don't want to play." Eli's expression darkened. "Stand up." With a whimper, Sarah obeyed, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. Eli circled her, his eyes boring into hers. "Tell me, Sarah," he said, his voice soft and menacing. "Have you ever betrayed someone you love?" Sarah's breath hitched. She glanced at Mark, her boyfriend, who was staring at her with wide, terrified eyes. I she stammered, her voice breaking. Eli leaned in closer, his breath hot against her face. The truth, Sarah. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she nodded. Yes, she whispered. I cheated on Mark. Last year. I was drunk, and I regretted it immediately. Mark's face went pale, his mouth opening in shock. Sarah. Eli chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down their spines. Interesting. He turned to Mark, his smile widening. Your turn. Mark stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. I'm not playing your sick game, he said, his voice trembling with anger. Eli's smile vanished. He moved so quickly that Mark didn't have time to react. The knife flashed, and Mark let out a cry as the blade grazed his cheek, leaving a thin line of blood. Sit down, Eli snarled. Mark obeyed, his hands shaking as he touched the cut on his face. Eli turned to Emily, the last member of the group. Your turn, he said, his voice dripping with malice. Emily shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. Please, I don't want to. Eli grabbed her by the hair, yanking her to her feet. She screamed, struggling against his grip, but he was too strong. Tell me, Emily, he said, his voice low and menacing. Have you ever wished someone dead? Emily's breath came in short, panicked gasps. And no, she stammered. Eli's eyes narrowed. Liar. The knife flashed, and Emily screamed as the blade sliced across her thigh. She collapsed to the floor, clutching her leg as blood seeped through her fingers. The truth, Eli said, his voice cold and unyielding. Emily sobbed, her body shaking with fear and pain. Yes, she whispered. My stepfather. He hurt my mom. I wished he would die. Eli smiled, a cruel, twisted smile that made her blood run cold. Good girl. He turned to the group, his eyes gleaming with a dark, manic light. Now that we've all been honest, it's time for the next round. The group stared at him in horror, their minds racing as they tried to comprehend what was happening. But before anyone could speak, Eli raised the knife, his smile widening. Let's see how far you're willing to go to survive. The cabin felt like a cage, its walls closing in as Eli loomed over the group, his knife glinting in the dim light. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smell of fear. Jake clutched his wounded arm. Sarah sobbed quietly. Mark's face was pale with shock, and Emily lay on the floor, her leg bleeding as she tried to stifle her cries. Eli paced slowly around the room, his boots creaking against the warped floorboards. His dark eyes flicked from one terrified face to another, savoring their fear like a predator savoring its prey. The next round is simple, he said, his voice low and menacing. You'll choose. Choose what? Mark asked, his voice trembling. Eli stopped in front of him, his smile cold and humorless. Who lives? And who dies? The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The group stared at him in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process what he'd just said. You're insane, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. Eli chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down their spines. Maybe, but you're the ones trapped here with me. He turned to Jake, who was still clutching his bleeding arm. You first, Eli said, pointing the knife at him. Choose. Jake shook his head, his face pale with terror. I can't. Eli's smile vanished. He grabbed Jake by the collar, yanking him to his feet. Choose, he snarled, his voice filled with venom. Jake's eyes darted to his friends, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I choose. No, Sarah screamed, her voice filled with desperation. Don't do this. Eli turned to her, his eyes gleaming with malice. Interfere again, and I'll make you watch. Sarah fell silent, her body trembling as she hugged herself tightly. Jake looked at his friends, his eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, he whispered. Then, his voice barely audible, he said, I choose. Emily. Emily's eyes widened in horror. Jake, no. Eli smiled, a cruel, twisted smile that made Jake's stomach churn. Interesting choice, he said, releasing Jake and turning to Emily. Emily scrambled backward, her wounded leg dragging behind her. "Please don't." Eli ignored her pleas, his eyes gleaming with dark excitement. He grabbed her by the hair, yanking her to her feet. She screamed, struggling against his grip, but he was too strong. "Let her go," Mark shouted, standing up, but Eli swung the knife in his direction, forcing him to back down. "Sit," Eli growled, his voice low and menacing. Mark obeyed, his hands clenched into fists as he watched helplessly. Eli turned back to Emily, his smile widening. "Don't worry," he said, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. "This will only hurt for a moment." Before anyone could react, Eli plunged the knife into Emily's chest. The room erupted into screams as Emily's body went limp, her eyes wide with shock. Eli let her fall to the floor, her blood pooling around her as the life drained from her eyes. "No!" Sarah screamed, her voice filled with anguish. Eli turned to the group, his smile cold and unfeeling. "One down," he said, his voice calm and measured. "Who's next?" The group stared at him in stunned silence, their minds reeling from what they'd just witnessed. Jake collapsed to his knees, his body shaking with sobs. "You monster," Mark whispered, his voice trembling with rage. Eli chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down their spines. "Monster? Maybe, but you're the ones who chose." He turned to Sarah, his eyes gleaming with dark excitement. "Your turn," he said, pointing the knife at her. Sarah shook her head, her entire body trembling. "Please don't." Eli grabbed her by the arm, yanking her to her feet. She screamed, struggling against his grip, but he was too strong. "Choose," he said, his voice low and menacing. Sarah's eyes darted to Mark and Jake, her breath coming in short, panic gasps. I can't." Eli's smile vanished. He pressed the knife to her throat, the blade cold against her skin. "Choose," he snarled. Tears streamed down Sarah's cheeks as she looked at Mark, her boyfriend, who was staring at her with wide, terrified eyes. I choose," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I choose. Jake." Jake's eyes widened in horror. "Sarah, no." Eli smiled, a cruel, twisted smile that made Sarah's stomach churn. He released her, turning to Jake. "Interesting choice," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Jake scrambled backward, his hands raised in a futile attempt to defend himself. "Please don't." Eli ignored his pleas, his eyes gleaming with dark excitement. He grabbed Jake by the collar, yanking him to his feet. "Let him go," Mark shouted, standing up, but Eli swung the knife in his direction, forcing him to back down. "Sit," Eli growled, his voice low and menacing. Mark obeyed, his hands clenched into fists as he watched helplessly. Eli turned back to Jake, his smile widening. "Don't worry," he said, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. "This will only hurt for a moment." Before anyone could react, Eli plunged the knife into Jake's chest. The room erupted into screams as Jake's body went limp, his eyes wide with shock. Eli let him fall to the floor, his blood pooling around him as the life drained from his eyes. "No!" Sarah screamed, her voice filled with anguish. Eli turned to the group, his smile cold and unfeeling. "Two down," he said, his voice calm and measured. "Who's next?" The group stared at him in stunned silence, their minds reeling from what they'd just witnessed. Sarah collapsed to her knees, her body shaking with sobs. "You monster," Mark whispered, his voice trembling with rage. Eli chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down their spines. "Monster? Maybe, but you're the ones who chose." He turned to Mark, his eyes gleaming with dark excitement. "Your turn," he said, pointing the knife at him. Mark stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. "I'm not playing your sick game," he said, his voice trembling with anger. Eli's smile vanished. He moved so quickly that Mark didn't have time to react. The knife flashed, and Mark let out a cry as the blade grazed his cheek, leaving a thin line of blood. "Sit down," Eli snarled, Mark obeyed, his hands shaking as he touched the cut on his face. Eli turned to Sarah, the last member of the group. "Your turn," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Sarah shook her head, her entire body trembling. "Please, I don't want to." Eli grabbed her by the hair, yanking her to her feet. She screamed, struggling against his grip, but he was too strong. "Choose," he said, his voice low and menacing. Sarah's eyes darted to Mark, her breath coming in short, panic gasps. "I choose." Eli's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with dark excitement. "I choose myself." The cabin was deathly silent, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid stench of fear. Sarah's words hung in the air like a death sentence, her voice trembling but resolute. "I choose myself." Eli's smile faltered for a moment, his dark eyes narrowing as he studied her. Then, slowly, he began to laugh, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down her spine. "You think you're brave, don't you?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think sacrificing yourself will save him?" He gestured toward Mark, who was sitting on the floor, his face pale and streaked with blood. Sarah's breath hitched, but she held his gaze. "If it means he lives, then yes." Eli's laughter died abruptly, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. He stepped closer, the knife glinting in his hand. "You don't get to decide how this ends," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I do." He grabbed her by the arm, yanking her to her feet. Sarah cried out, struggling against his grip, but he was too strong. He dragged her to the center of the room, where the fire's embers cast flickering shadows on the walls. "Kneel," he commanded, his voice sharp and unyielding. Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting to Mark. He was staring at her, his face filled with anguish. "Sarah, don't." Eli swung the knife in Mark's direction, silencing him. "One more word, and I'll make this much worse." Mark fell silent, his hands clenched into fists as he watched helplessly. Sarah knelt on the floor, her body trembling. The cold, warped wood bit into her knees, and the smell of blood filled her nostrils. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, but the fear was overwhelming. Eli circled her, his boots creaking against the floorboards. "You think you're the hero of this story," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "But you're not. You're just another victim." He stopped behind her, his breath hot against her neck. "Any last words?" Sarah's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She thought of Mark, of the life they could have had together. She thought of Jake and Emily, their lifeless bodies lying on the floor. And then she thought of Eli, his cold, empty eyes, his twisted smile. "You're wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Eli leaned closer, his knife pressing against her throat. "What was that?" Sarah took a deep breath, her voice trembling but defiant. "You're wrong. I'm not just a victim, and this isn't your story." Before Eli could react, Sarah lunged forward, grabbing a shard of broken glass from the floor. She spun around, slashing at Eli's face with all her strength. He let out a roar of pain, stumbling backward as blood poured from the gash on his cheek. The knife fell from his hand, clattering to the floor. "Mark, run!" Sarah screamed, scrambling to her feet. Mark didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed a piece of firewood from the hearth and swung it at Eli with all his might. The wood connected with Eli's head, sending him crashing to the floor. "Come on!" Mark shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand. They bolted for the door, their hearts pounding as they stumbled into the freezing night. The woods were dark and silent, the trees looming like silent sentinels. "Which way?" Sarah gasped, her breath visible in the cold air. Mark hesitated, his eyes scanning the trees. "I don't know. Just run." They sprinted through the woods, their feet crunching in the snow. The cabin disappeared behind them, swallowed by the darkness. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. Behind them, they heard a roar of rage, Eli's voice, filled with fury. "You can't escape me." Sarah's heart raced as she pushed herself to run faster. Her legs burned, and her lungs felt like they were on fire. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. They ran for what felt like hours, the woods stretching endlessly around them. Finally, they burst into a clearing, their eyes widening as they saw a road ahead. "There!" Mark shouted, pointing to a pair of headlights in the distance. They ran toward the road, waving their arms and screaming for help. The car slowed, then stopped, and a man stepped out, his face filled with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his eyes widening as he saw their bloodied, disheveled state. "Please," Sarah gasped, tears streaming down her face. "Help us." The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. Sarah and Mark sat in the back of an ambulance, wrapped in blankets as they recounted their ordeal. "We need to find him," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "He's still out there." The officers exchanged grim looks. "We'll search the woods," one of them said, "but it's a big area. It might take time." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. She thought of Eli, his cold, empty eyes, his twisted smile. She thought of Jake and Emily, their lifeless bodies lying on the cabin floor. And then, she thought of the carvings on the walls, the strange symbols etched into the wood. She hadn't understood them at the time, but now they haunted her. As the ambulance drove away, Sarah glanced out the window, her eyes scanning the dark woods. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing among the trees, watching them. But when she blinked, it was gone. The police never found Eli. The cabin was empty when they searched it, the fire long since extinguished. The only evidence of what had happened were the bloodstains on the floor and the strange carvings on the walls. Sarah and Mark tried to move on, but the nightmares never stopped. They saw Eli's face in their dreams, his cold, empty eyes staring into theirs. They heard his voice, low and menacing, whispering in their ears, "You can't escape me." And then, one night, Sarah woke to the sound of footsteps outside her window. She froze, her heart pounding as she crept to the window and peered outside. The street was empty, but on the ground, just beneath her window, was a single, rusted knife. And carved into the handle were the same symbols she'd seen in the cabin.